Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs with the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, at Georgetown University. Today, we'll look at India's global standing in the development of artificial intelligence, along with India's importance as a US partner in this field. But before we start, I'd like to do a brief bit of housekeeping. All the attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and alert us, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. And now it's time for our moderator to get things started. Dr. Melissa Flagg is a senior fellow with CSET and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. Previously, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research, responsible for policy and oversight of Defense Department science and technology programs. She has worked at the State Department, the Office of Naval Research, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, as well as the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and the Army Research Laboratory. She served on numerous boards, including the National Academy of Sciences Air Force Studies Board, the Department of Commerce Emerging Technology Research Advisory Committee, and the Board of Humanity 2050. Melissa, over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. I am genuinely excited to be here today to introduce Husan Chahal. We have worked together for the last 2 years at CSET, where she is a research analyst. Prior to that, she spent some time, very interestingly, at the World Bank's Corporate Security Division, as well as at Prevalent, a cybersecurity risk management firm in DC. Before that, she actually finished up her graduate degree at Georgetown, go Hoyas, with a range of impressive honors, and I'll let you read all about her online if you want to. Before that, she actually worked in 2 New Delhi-based think tanks, one of which is the think tank aligned to the Indian Ministry of Defense. That is the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, as well as the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, examining security issues in South Asia. Before that, and in addition to her degree at Georgetown, she also holds a master's in international security and terrorism from the University of Nottingham, and a bachelor's degree in political science from Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi. I think this is so important because she brings a multinational lens, as well as a real understanding of defense and security issues through the lens of the Indian government. One of the things that we really, I think, are challenged with sometimes in the United States is having a very US-centric view of the world. So it's exciting to have Husan here to give us some perspective through a very data-driven, evidence-based view, but also using her context and experience on 3 continents, really as the expert in the room on this topic. So with that, Husan, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I can't wait to learn something today.
Yes, thank you so much, Melissa, for that generous introduction. And I'd say thank you so much, everyone, for your interest in CSET's research. I can see so many familiar names joining in for this talk, and I just want to say that it's really exciting to be here, and it's really exciting to be able to present the findings of this very comprehensive report, one which has probably touched upon nearly every data set we have at CSET in one way or the other. Yes, so okay, so again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And today we'll be looking to examine where does India stand in the global AI race, building upon recent work that we've been doing at CSET. So we spent a good deal of time looking at India's tech sector, examining its AI potential. But a question to start with here is, why does it really matter to look at India's AI capabilities? Now, I'll walk you through some of the reasons for why we should care for this topic, but let me begin by putting my bottom line up front to you. India could play an important role on the global stage as a consumer, data creator, and developer of AI, and will be among the key voices setting the norms surrounding this technology. So first and foremost is the sheer numbers game. India being the second most populous country with over half of its population under the age of 25, means that it matters a lot how the country is developing and using AI technologies. It is certainly important for us to know what is the level of preparedness in a country that will be providing AI to 1/6 of the humanity. And what is the state of the tech sector in this region that will be providing over 1 billion data producers and owners to this world potentially? Not only as consumers, it's also important to look at India because its population will also likely play a key role in developing AI. Now, the HAI team at Stanford, as part of its AI Index report, described how the share of AI skills as part of the top 50 skills in the Indian workforce is the highest in the world, indicating that India's workforce is perhaps the most adept to AI skills. When you couple this data with other findings like India experienced one of the fastest growths in AI hiring between 2015 and 2019, and also the fact that India's startup ecosystem is currently the third largest in the world, it further underlines the significance of why we should study the country's tech sector. Now, all of this is not really hidden from the Indian government, which launched its national AI strategy in 2018 and has in recent years really amplified its efforts to further improve its AI infrastructure. This is including by undertaking key initiatives in priority sectors and also by partnering with leading tech players in the private sector to make progress. In addition to this, the United States has been actively partnering with India on emerging technologies via initiatives like the Quad, and the US National Security Commission on AI even proposed creating a US-India Strategic Tech Alliance, citing the country's tech talent, strong innovation, technical infrastructures, and especially when paired with its shared commitment to freedom and democratic principles. India will be one of the most crucial US allies in the global AI race. And just to reiterate, this is apart from India being one of the biggest consumers, data creator, and developer of AI. Despite all of this, we were quite surprised to see that there is no single holistic assessment of India's technological capabilities in AI. And that's where we stepped in. We initiated this project last year, drawing from a variety of original data sets we have at CSET, as well as other primary data sources. We evaluated India's potential for AI by examining its progress across 5 categories of indicators pertinent to AI development that you can see here. That is talent, research, patents, compute, and companies and investment. These 5 elements are widely regarded as crucial enablers of AI, and they also represent CSET's own active lines of research in studying the technology. Today, I'm going to present to you some of our most important findings across these 5 indicators to give you a picture of India's AI landscape and conclude with some key takeaways and some reflections on India-US relations. Now, let me quickly preview the findings by saying these 3 things. Our research on India's performance across the 5 metrics reveals that the country benefits from having a huge tech talent pool, being one of the top producers of AI research, and having a rapid growing innovation scene. But it lags on compute, research collaborations, and investment flows into its tech sector. We also saw that there are strong arguments in favor of an India-US AI partnership, with extensive evidence of existing ties between the 2 countries across most of these 5 levels. So first we start with talent, which for AI very often gets conceptualized as the quality and quantity of computer science and engineering graduates in a country. In our research, we looked at engineering graduates only specifically, and as you can see, the numbers here are from 2016 and 17. Now, this is mostly because of cross-country measurement challenges, mainly because countries are not uniform in the way that they classify disciplines and report numbers. And this was the only field actually, and the only timeline that the 3 had consistent data. Now, a lot of AI experts see talent as one of the most important of all AI indicators. And the argument put forward is that talent is almost a precursor to most other AI levels. The stronger a country's talent pipeline, the better its research output, and the more it tells you about the quality of a country's domestic AI workforce, and also the better the innovation and so on. Now, in looking at AI talent in India, I'd say that we came across some of the most interesting findings of our study in this section. We saw that India has this huge talent pool. Now, the bachelor level figures are actually not represented here, but we found that India produces almost 7 times more bachelor's graduates in engineering as the United States, and almost twice as many master's level engineering graduates. However, it produced less than 1/3 PhDs in comparison. Now, we know that there's generally a shortage of high quality talent in the AI industrial community that can perform research on cutting edge AI algorithms. But still, when you compare proportions, it was surprising to note that the share of doctoral students remain under 4% when looking at graduates in all AI relevant fields in India. So we wanted to know, why do these numbers shrink so much in proportion in India? And dug deeper to find that there were a number of reasons. Primarily, weaknesses in India's higher education sector. These weaknesses limit its ability to continue training a highly skilled AI workforce at scale. There is an absence of sufficient research centers in most Indian universities. There's shortage of qualified teachers, lack of access to financial support for students, and complex regulatory norms, you name it. All of these contribute to affecting the quality of higher education in India. As a result, you see that a lot of the Indian students move abroad for higher studies. United States stands out as the most popular choice, with over 36% of outbound Indian students moving to the US in 2016. Now, when you look at numbers within the United States, you see that nearly 14% of all international students in the US are from India. And this is second only to China. But it was interesting to see that when you look at numbers specifically for mathematics, computer science, and engineering in the past decade, Indian students in the US outnumbered their Chinese counterparts in the past 6 out of 10 years. Basically, there may be more Chinese students moving to the US for studies, but when you look at STEM students, and specifically in computer science, maths, and engineering, a majority of the last decade saw a lot more Indian students coming in for these fields. Therefore, we see that India produces a huge talent pool, but struggles to nurture it by providing it the right environment. And it is also a big supplier of AI talent to other parts of the world, primarily the United States. Moving on to research. For this section, we looked at how many scientific AI papers were published by Indian authors in CSET's merged corpus of scholarly literature, which I should say collectively captures over 90% of the world's scholarly output. So we saw that India is one of the top producers of AI research. And between 2010 to 2019, it produced over 84,000 AI papers, ranking 4th, closely behind the UK. Even though it is true that India produces a relatively high number of AI papers, it appears that Indian researchers are mostly going at it alone. We saw that Indian scholars tend to co-author AI research papers less frequently with scholars from other countries. Only 16% of these 84,000 papers had at least one non-Indian co-author, which was actually the lowest share among all top 10 AI research producing countries that you see here. And why is this important? This is important mainly because it is widely believed that international collaborations benefit research quality and impact. This means that all of this massive AI research corpus that India is producing, it continues to lag in quality and impact, which gets confirmed when you look at citation counts for these papers that brings India's ranking from 4th down to 15th globally on citation counts. Now, within the smaller set of papers where Indian authors were collaborating with international authors, there was a very interesting trend that we saw. We saw that Indian AI researchers co-author papers at least 5 times more frequently with US researchers than any other country in the world. In fact, India-US co-authored papers were roughly half of the total paper collaborations Indian researchers had with the rest of the world combined. Carnegie Mellon University in the US and the IITs in India emerged as top collaborators. So we also examined the top research subfields within AI that Indian researchers focus on. As you can see here, Indian scientists have written maximum papers on pattern recognition. To put into context, pattern recognition is useful in real-world applications, like in classifying whether an email is spam or not, or in cancer detection by looking at lab scans. Now, India's pattern recognition research production was notable, but not remarkable. Because, generally, a lot of countries generally tend to produce more on pattern recognition. What was worth noting, however, was India's production of speech recognition research, which, as you can see here, represents 5% of its AI papers. Speech recognition technology is important because it features in digital assistants like Alexa and Siri that we use commonly, and voice-activated customer service, and much more. Now, we saw that Indian researchers generally tend to produce more papers on speech recognition versus the rest of the world, with Indian papers on the topic accounting for 9% of all papers on this topic produced globally. One reason for this, we estimate, could be the vast linguistic variations amongst its population, providing ample opportunities to research the field. So to sum it up, India is a huge producer of AI research, but it lacks sufficient international collaborations affecting its research quality and global impact. And AI subfields like speech and pattern recognition are established fields that occupy an important place in the country's scientific progression. So we've looked at talent and research. Next, we come to patents, which we saw as a rough measure of a country's inventive activity. Now, some of our most surprising findings in all of our research on India came in the patent section. We knew that India has traditionally fared poorly in patent filings due to a number of reasons, including poor infrastructure and limited resources for processing patent applications, weak IP protections, limited R&D, and you can say a general lack of a patenting culture. But we were quite surprised to find that India still ranked in the top 10 AI patent producing countries, having witnessed high growth in AI patent applications of roughly 10 times in 2018 in comparison to 2012. This growth could be due to several reasons, including recent improvements in India's patent system and companies beginning to see the benefit of using patents to protect its innovations. Despite this recent progress, I'd say India still has a long road ahead to catch up with the US or China, and also with other countries like Japan and South Korea. Now, it's interesting to evaluate the top application fields for India's AI patents. We saw that the 4 largest categories of AI patents in India are personal devices and computing, business, life sciences, and telecommunications, which are collectively associated with more than 70% of all of India's AI patents. This finding underscored the point that Indian innovators have focused on applying AI to areas of traditional strength like medicine, IT, e-commerce, and customer relations. One thing to note here is that when we compared India's results to the global trends, we noticed that India produced slightly more patents than the rest of the world in business. But one thing it clearly underperforms on is the field of transportation. Transportation, which contains subfields like autonomous vehicles, avionics, etc., is the most popular patent application field globally, representing 24% of all AI patents, whereas in India, this field comprised only 3% of all patent filings. So taken together, despite India's history of low patent counts overall, India has come a long way in AI patenting, witnessing massive growth starting 2012. More than 2/3 of these AI patents belong to the 4 application fields that we can say are also areas of traditional strength in the Indian market, with business standing out as a field where India outperforms the world and transportation where it underperforms. Moving on, we look at computing power, which can generally be seen as the engine that runs AI. As AI systems become more sophisticated, they require specialized AI computer chips to speed up training and cost-effectively process petabytes of data. Now, since India does not have a domestic capacity to manufacture these AI chips and its associated computing infrastructure, most of India's AI market relies on public cloud computing power made available by vendors like Amazon Web Services and also Google Cloud. Therefore, we saw market cloud computing spending as a useful proxy for India's capacity to support its cloud computing needs. And we derived the data for this section from NASSCOM, which is an industry association for India's IT and services sector. Of all the indicators we looked at, this is one where India's performance can still be considered at a nascent stage in comparison to the world average. This is because in comparison to the rest of the world, India spends a small proportion of its GDP on its IT, and of all the money that it spends on its IT, it spends an even smaller proportion on cloud. In comparison to the world average of 7.9%, as you can see, India's market cloud computing spending was only 6% or $2.5 billion. One thing to note here is that even though India's numbers are much lower here, its cloud market is one of the fastest growing markets currently, with rising demands for computing power that are expected to grow at double-digit rates as per most forecasts. If the Indian government emphasizes the various infrastructural and operational factors that drive cloud growth further in the country, including reliable power, sustainable land regulations, high-speed connectivity, among others, we estimate that this trend of growth will likely continue. For now, it seems that India lags in the capacity to support its cloud computing needs for AI and has a rapidly growing domestic cloud market with rising demands for computing capacity. Last but not the least is the companies and investment indicator, for which we looked at equity investment flows into privately held AI companies headquartered in India. Or in other words, you can say venture capital funding in India's startup ecosystem. I'll be happy to discuss the methodology in the Q&A for the section, but we feel that looking at this specific slice of equity funding in startups is an important slice for anyone looking to evaluate AI competitiveness, because it can give us some meaningful insights into the health and innovation of a country's commercial sector. So when you look at investment flows at the chart listed here, one thing I should clarify is that in many AI investment transactions, the parties, for whatever reasons, never really reveal the deal amount or how much money have they invested in a startup in a specific round. So apart from disclosed investments, we use two other metrics, that is estimated amounts and transaction counts, in order to get a view of the market as a whole. So as you can see here in the chart, we have numbers for the transaction counts, or the number of investments, which is like a venture capital funding rounds or merger transactions that target Indian AI companies. And we see that these transaction counts have witnessed a consistent growth in India. As for the estimated investments, now for those deals where transaction amounts were not disclosed, as I mentioned earlier, we try to estimate what those deal amounts might be using median values from similar deals, basically. The figures across both disclosed and estimated investments show that investments into private AI companies in India grew steadily between 2015 and 2018, after which it nearly tripled in dollar value. Now, interestingly, the percentage jump in investment growth for India in 2019 was higher than that of any other country, including the United States and China. Therefore, we can say that there has clearly been significant growth in investment flows into Indian AI companies recently. Although I should highlight that the amount of investments are much smaller in India, especially when you compare the figures to that of China or the US. Of all the investments Indian companies receive, we can say that Indian investors are evidently the biggest players in the Indian market on all fronts, which is not really surprising. On the other hand, when you look at foreign investment flows that are moving into these AI companies, we see that US and China-based investors are some of the most important players. But the US investors far outpace the Chinese in the Indian market when we compare the number of investment transactions they were involved in. We saw that American investors were engaged in almost 7 times more AI investment transactions and invested roughly 3 to 5 times more in comparison to the Chinese counterparts, which indicates that values of Chinese investment flows into India, at least on the equity investment side, appear to be overstated. When we looked at data on application areas of these companies, we saw that over half of all Indian AI companies that are applying AI to its products are using it for business analytics, medicine, finance, and sales, retail, and customer relations. And they tend to attract 60% of all equity funding. As you can see here, very few companies are applying it for security and biometrics or military and public safety, which supports the idea that commercial interests are the primary driver of AI development in India's private sector. And a vast majority of equity investments going into private companies in India are not focused on government needs. So all in all, I'd say India's AI startup ecosystem attracts lesser investments when compared to the US and China. However, there has clearly been a significant growth in both domestic and foreign investment flows into privately held Indian AI companies, especially after 2018. Among foreign investors in the Indian market, US investors are the biggest players, and the bigger chunk of money coming for these startups is mostly to support commercial interests. To sum up all that we've learned across the 5 metrics, we can say that India has the potential to position itself as an important player and a valuable partner in the AI ecosystem. But serious obstacles, of course, remain. In terms of what India brings to the table, I'd say that India has a huge potential tech talent pool, which it is also supplying to a lot of countries. It is a large producer of AI research with a unique scholarly potential in certain notable subfields like speech recognition. And finally, it has a rapidly growing innovation scene. On the other hand, what India needs to reach its AI potential, it needs more computing power, investments, and global research collaborations. Interestingly, for all of these needs, it is dependent upon players outside its borders. Therefore, the significance of global partnerships cannot be overemphasized for India's AI future. Which is why we come to my final slide. Now, across all of these 5 indicators, the prevalence of India-US interactions and widespread evidence of existing ties are hard to miss, be it in talent flows, research collaborations, investment flows into Indian AI companies, or even the role of the US private sector in providing cloud computing capacity to India's IT sector. Alignment between the two countries on AI is quite clear. I'll say, moving forward, in order for this partnership to grow and be successful, the two countries need to provide a healthy environment to educate and train future AI innovators, which in the long term means building the right technological and academic infrastructures in India to nurture its AI talent, but in the short term can take the shape of facilitating educational exchanges, including by building US university campuses in India. A successful India-US AI partnership will also look to provide low-cost and accessible cloud infrastructure to smaller entities in both countries that cannot afford the expenses of training data-hungry algorithms to advance innovation. And finally, a successful partnership between India and the US will rely on further strengthening research collaborations, IP cooperation, and investor ties. For this part, India's tech talent diaspora in the US can play a crucial role as a connector. But for it to be successful, India will have to improve its regulatory apparatus, especially for overseas Indians looking to work in India. And the US has to improve its immigration system that has been hard on Indian immigrants in recent years. To sum up everything, India is advancing and is a strong AI player, especially in talent, research production, and innovation. It is still struggling with computing power and requires more research co-authorships and investment flows. And there are really exciting opportunities for India to collaborate with the US, through which both countries can advance their AI ambitions and have a mutually beneficial partnership on AI. I'd just like to close by saying that I cannot take credit for everything. We have a wonderful team at CSET that worked on this project, and we continue to work on related projects. And I just want to thank all of these folks here for all their efforts in contributing to this research, and to many others at CSET who have continued to provide critical support in the form of feedback, reviews, edits, and much more. And finally, you can read this report and find more information on our website listed here. You can subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, or if you'd like to get in touch with me, here's my email and my Twitter handle. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening.
And thank you, Husan. Teamwork makes the dream work. And for those who'd like to read a little bit more by Husan on the subject of today's conversation, she had an op-ed in this week's, in The Diplomat this week. You can find that online as well as on CSET's website. Now, I'm sure there are going to be a number of questions and comments. Melissa gets to exercise the moderator's prerogative and kick off the Q&A herself. In the meantime, if anyone would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and it will be read aloud. Those who are phoning in for this webinar, unfortunately, won't be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here. Melissa, back over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. Husan, it's great. Every time I hear you talk about this report, it makes me more and more excited. I feel like sometimes the US frames the world in this very bilateral lens, and I'm commonly quoted as saying, you know, half of the global R&D investment is not the US or China. And so when you do a holistic assessment like this, it really reminds us how critical some of our allies are. With India specifically, as the collaboration around the Quad and conversations around this as a geopolitical tool of importance right now heats up, I do think it's interesting that you talk about what would traditionally be framed as a brain drain of Indian talent to the United States, but you frame it really through the lens of something that is a win-win. I wondered if you could dive into that a bit deeper and maybe expose a little bit of why you don't think India sees it as a brain drain, or perhaps they do.
Yeah, Melissa, that's actually a very great point. And it relates to the article that Lynn was just mentioning. And in that piece, I talked about India's tech talent flows to the US as being uniquely a win-win for both countries. and the fact that it'll play a crucial role in advancing both of the country's AI ambitions, as well as for any partnerships that they may have in the future. And why I say this is because if you look at India's tech talent figures, you see that India produces this huge talent pool, like we discussed in our presentation today. But due to weaknesses in its higher education system and also poor job growth, its economy is not able to absorb this talent. So you see that a small part of this tech talent moves abroad, primarily to the US. Now, unlike a lot of other countries that are racing to become AI leaders and competing to control the best expertise, and therefore launching policy measures to attract their best and brightest back into the country, like the 1,000 Talents Plan or South Korea's Brain Return 500 project as examples. In contrast, we see that India has done almost little to nothing on this front. And this is mostly because the Indian government doesn't really see this as a brain drain situation. In fact, an Indian policy official in the past has even gone on record to say that for India, a brain drain is actually better than a brain in the drain. So kind of acknowledging the challenges that the country faces in nurturing this talent pool that it has. So in addition to this, what the Indian government sees is like greater remittances, more knowledge sharing, investor ties, and to some extent, greater academic exchanges that are coming out of this talent flows to the US and also other countries, and that kind of ultimately benefit India's own researchers and its tech sector. So the Indian government in recent years has actually launched initiatives to improve ties with non-resident Indians. And this is, for example, by holding diaspora conferences that are aiming to create like a community among the expatriates, or even by launching like the PIO or OCI cards in the early 2000s, which was about giving special identity documents to allow overseas nationals, Indians, to travel without visas and certain other rights. But throughout, what you don't see in the Indian policy decisions or like government reports is this desire to bring back this talent altogether. And it's certainly to engage more with them, but not to bring back. Now, this creates for a very unique situation for India and the US. Tech talent flows become mutually beneficial for both. You see Indian tech talent moving to the US, getting PhDs, working in big tech companies like Amazon and Google, or even starting their own AI companies that kind of ultimately give jobs to many Americans and benefit the US economy. So it really comes out as a mutually win-win situation for both, which is actually pretty unique in the AI sector globally that is racing to compete. And I think it's an important point to keep in mind and can really form a crucial part of India-US AI relations moving ahead.
Thank you. That's great. So I'm going to start pulling a few questions from the chat now. One question we have is, what do you think of the idea of and the potential of an AI arms race between the US and India and or the US and China? And maybe it's a moment to kind of compare and contrast our relationship with India versus our relationship with China. There are a few questions about this in the chat. So any perspective you have on that?
So I think like what you're alluding to is not something that is in particular like a US-India thing, but it's more like a geopolitical kind of like a concern when it comes to AI, that this competitiveness in AI can really be seen as an AI arms race scenario that can lead countries to compete. This kind of goes beyond my report and my the focus area, but I believe that AI competitiveness is healthy for tech sectors across the world, and if looked at in the right manner and developed in ways that can kind of create that can sort of kind of stop any quote unquote authoritarian practices to get developed in this technology coming forward. I think it's totally fair in that sense, and it's important for countries to kind of look at it and let the best kind of technology come up.
That's great. I will also just mention for the audience that Andrew Embry, senior fellow at CSET, has done some interesting work on thinking about this frame of AI as an arms race. And so I would definitely suggest you chat with him if you want to dig more deeply into that. Okay, so let me pull another question. You commented that Indian researchers tend not to collaborate with other researchers, international researchers. Do you have a sense of why? Is it cultural? Is it a national security oriented issue? Or is it topic funding related, do you think?
So it's actually a mixture of all of those things, if you ask me. So I'd say that this kind of like high collaboration, which is like at least 5 times more with US researchers, happened mostly because of, I mean, we can give credit to some early policy initiatives that were launched by India and US, like, for example, the IUSSTF, which is the India-US Science and Technology Forum, which was launched in somewhere in the 2000s. That was really focused only upon like fostering more R&D collaboration between the two countries. So, I mean, having said that, I would say with other countries, in general, I mean, so there was a survey that was conducted by a scholar, and in that, like, so the Indian scholars, kind of authors, listed the top reasons for why, what are the problems for them in terms of international collaborations. And some of the things that came up was bureaucratic hurdles, lack of funding, and to some extent even visa issues, which I should really highlight, because what tends to happen in science and technology research is that a lot of the researchers look to kind of go, not only like require funds to go abroad, but also visas, but at the same time be present in a country and work in labs and like research centers for a longer period of time. So in that sense, like, those are some of the hurdles that researchers often kind of mention, and I think all of them do play a role in why there are like few international collaborations with India.
That's great, thank you. All right, here's another interesting one. Could you give some specific examples of what you mean when you refer to AI companies? What are the sizes of these firms? Are these small and big shops lumped together? I think this would be a good chance to talk a little bit about that methodology.
Oh, yes, of course. So actually, first of all, I should really plug my colleague Zach Arnold's AI investment report here, which is actually an excellent report, and I highly recommend anyone who's interested in this topic more should look more deeper into that, and can certainly, there are a lot more methodological details to go into in that report as well. But in terms of the sizing of the companies, so these are like mostly smaller companies. So when we say privately owned companies, these are not, so all the things that exclude this are companies that are traded on a stock exchange, or like big tech companies. So you have the smaller companies with sizes, honestly, that really vary. And I mean, I can give you some examples that came up in our research, and these include organizations like Niramai, which is doing a lot of AI research on breast cancer. And then there's one called Haptic, which is a conversational platform, like conversational AI platform that works on speech recognition stuff. So yeah, these are just a few examples that I can give. Like smaller startups is what we meant.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so here's another one that's more focused on IP. Do you have thoughts on what focus areas you would suggest for IP cooperation between the US and India?
Well, I mean, our report says no transportation. That's one thing. Well, I'm just joking. But I mean, business analytics. So, like I mentioned, there are 4 areas that already comprise 70% of most of India's AI patents. So maybe something. It really varies actually. So, like it would be an interesting pattern to kind of also compare and contrast. So for US and India, like what are the top, where do the two countries align, and what could be possible areas for them to collaborate? But any of those 4 categories would definitely be a huge, I would say, success in India. But I mean, at the same time, I should say that transportation being a sector where India underperforms, and that could be, I mean, one of the reasons that you can anticipate this could be because of a lot of the infrastructure issues that India has in terms of like transportation research and a whole range of other things, and which I think can also be like a good kind of ground for collaboration between researchers to kind of do that.
That's great. I do think along these lines as well, it would be really interesting to see what US companies are very active in these sectors where India is also patenting. There might be areas there that are really ripe for cooperation, where the governments could learn from a lot of this cooperation that's already going on kind of at the ground level, kind of grassroots. So here's one that just came in. How is India dealing with concerns of data protection and privacy? Data is the fuel that drives AI. Are India's safeguards adequate? I know there's been some stuff in the news around this, so maybe this is a chance to highlight some of that.
Yeah, this has actually been very controversial the past few months, and I would say like Indian government has been in a lot of tiffs all throughout 2021 with big tech companies in the US on this. And but on data protection, I'd say like the big thing that Indian government did was in 2019 December, they actually sort of launched their data protection bill in the Indian Parliament for discussion. And this is kind of based on EU's GDPR, but there is one provision that it actually differs on, which is treating data as a national asset, which means there are data localization laws, and like companies that are working in India, there's some requirement about storing data locally. So in that sense, and this has been a very controversial provision that has been attracting a lot of debates. And not, I mean, all of them are being debated thoroughly, and a lot of the opposition leaders are pretty active on this in the parliament, and lots of civil society activists as well. And what happened recently actually somewhat related, like this big tiff between in the Indian government and WhatsApp. And that is mostly like a traceability versus encryption problem. So what WhatsApp, what Indian government kind of did was that they like sort of put in an executive order earlier in February this year, and that kind of you could say like what they put a provision on all tech companies that have over 5 million users in India. And what they said was that they want information of the first originator of these messages that these social messaging apps are receiving. And this is mostly, I mean, like as per request in terms of when they face national security threats or other threats, or like, if there are any or serious offenses for that matter. So, I mean, yes, of course, this gained a lot of controversy, and there are a lot of debates, and with WhatsApp really saying that this is a threat to privacy, and yes, I mean, in that sense, I'd say like there's a huge debate that's going on right now in the Indian civil society on what the Indian government's position is on across all of the provisions in the data protection bill, as well as what the recent regulation. And but yeah, I mean, fingers crossed for the best to come. But the only hope I would say is the fact that there is a lot of attention on this within India, and everyone's debating this, and it's important, and I'm keeping fingers crossed for the best.
Great. I'm going to combine two questions a bit here. One question was focused on when you chose these indicators in your paper, did you consider using data as one of those 5 indicators, and any reasons for not including that in your research? And then along those same lines, do you think lax data protection and AI regulation in India impacts investment flows into the country?
Interesting. Okay, I'll begin by answering the first one. So that's actually a really good question. And I should say that when we started our project, we very early on realized that data is an important lever, certainly in AI development, but we chose not to include it for a lot of reasons. And this is to begin with, like what happens is that a lot of the data needs for AI are very task specific. And what happens is like a lot of the metrics currently that look at a country's data competitiveness that are existing out there, they look at very broad metrics like a country population, or let's say like the number of digital payments. So all of these metrics, even though they're helpful, but they're still very broad. And because of that reason, we decided to kind of not look at that, and instead we've actually published a report on a very similar topic as well, and where we actually say that what would instead be interesting to look at would be a country's data management infrastructures as a measure to see how adept a country is in kind of or how competitive a country is in data, like how well can it store the data, transform the data, and make it like available and ready to be deployed in AI algorithms. So yes, like, but I mean, at the same time, it's very hard to, like, it requires a more of a qualitative approach, and it probably would have gone beyond the scope of a project. So that is one of the reasons that we decided not to choose it as a lever. And just to be clear, so the second question talked about
really this, do you feel like there are lax data protection and AI regulation sort of approaches in India that are affecting the decision for people to invest in India?
I would say that is true, but at the same time, like just to counter that as well, actually, because so the absence of data protections and specific laws, I mean, can be seen both ways. Of course, there is like more of like there's vagueness. You don't there isn't like you do not know what the Indian government will do next in that sense on data protection. But at the same time, it kind of allows and creates a space for lesser regulations on big tech companies, which is what we're seeing right now is happening. So it's gone both ways. But if you ask me personally, data protection in India, like given the huge market that it is for and like the number of data producers and consumers it will be generating, it is really important. And like in whatever form, even the current bill for that matter, it's like a great step, and just fingers crossed that it comes up soon.
I think this is super interesting. I really love that you pull out this conversation around data, and that it's not just a how many producers of data do you have or sheer volume of data that actually makes it data that is useful for AI. And again, that AI is really in a narrow AI moment at this point, and the data you have does not necessarily lead to easy transfer learning across sectors and across tasks. And so using these generic approaches to data, I know this is a conversation we've had internally at CSET a lot. I do think it's really important to hammer this home a little bit, that it was a very conscious choice to leave it out, not because we don't think it's important, but because we don't really think we have our hands around how to measure that effectively yet.
Yeah. I totally agree with you, Melissa. And actually, one thing I should say is India's data protection bill kind of also creates a data protection authority, which will be kind of the way it's envisioned is like it'll be a body that will have a repository of data. Like, I mean, ultimately the form it takes is to be debated, but it looks like it will have access to this amounts of data. And if I'm guessing, other countries might also be having similar data protection bills at some point. And if authorities at some point, maybe in the future, we can see that there could be a potential estimate that can be made depending on how much data we have available in terms of how much data that these bodies own. In the future, maybe we can give this a shot in a more, you can say, nuanced and methodological way. But
no, I think that's great. It's also a really interesting opportunity in the Quad to start to talk about, are there ways that we can come together around some of these data stores and think about how we can make them accessible across countries and have a much better understanding of what these data stores actually buy us in terms of effective AI. So we have another question that talks a little bit about that it's easier to track patents, but unregistered trade secrets are probably a better measure. Do you consider trade secrets as a sub-lever under patents? Is that one you feel comfortable tackling?
Well, not really, actually. I wouldn't say that patents is my forte here. Like more so because, like I said, we have a huge team working on this, and there's some others at CSET that I can definitely put you in touch with, who will be better positioned to answer this in terms of the data set that we had and the subsections like that it contained. But yes, it sounds interesting, and I think maybe could be a potential topic of research.
Yeah, one comment I'll just throw in on this is that there was a lot of conversation years ago that nobody wanted to patent in AI. And there was kind of this common belief that people don't patent in AI because it's such a fast moving field. The data that you've shown really suggests that that's just not the case anymore, not in the US, not in China, not in India, not in Japan. We've really seen an uptick of patenting in AI really since post maybe 2014, 2015. And I do think that trade secrets were probably more common before, but this is also just a result of the fact that AI is becoming real and it's becoming more applied as opposed to more theoretical. And so this is a natural progression. Trade secrets are important. We don't have a database of trade secrets at CSET. If we did, we would all be millionaires, but we don't. And so part of the reason we choose patents is because we are very focused on trying to be evidence-based. And so we worked with what we had. Here's another question. What are your thoughts on the divide between those who have access to digital tools and technology in India versus those that don't?
So honestly, like this is very much a reality of not only India, but like the world as well, like where you have a lot of developing economies who don't have access to certain resources. And in India, this divide, I mean, is definitely very evident when you look at specifically the computing access to like computing, cloud computing, or like other computing infrastructures. As you know, like cutting edge AI research requires a lot of like computing power. And at present, the Indian government has a few facilities, but they are very small scale R&D facilities that are not really capable of AI workloads at scale. And so the other options, like I mentioned, are mostly just private vendors for computing power, which makes it a lot more expensive. And yes, like you have this divide not only within India, in the world as well, and even within countries. I would say it's very true in the US as well, where you have big tech companies and smaller entities, and you ultimately end up having these haves and have-nots. And I'll just bring in the talent side here as well. As you know, like in the US, there is, there's bipartisan support for having immigration reform, and the National Security Commission on AI has said that immigration reform is a national security concern, and that's mostly also one of the reasons for this is also because the current immigration system is more like it's framed in a way that it makes big companies access talent much more easier than startups and small entities does. So in that sense, like be it compute or talent or other metrics, like you end up having this have and have not divide across the AI sector, which is something that like governments need to take care of, and in terms of through like partnerships, and also in general like through subsidies or so many other mechanisms to kind of really advance innovation across all like sectors of an economy.
Yeah, I think it's so challenging, and it's easy for us in the United States to often talk about this as a problem somewhere else, but we do really have this in the United States, especially in rural areas. I do think there are some interesting examples in places like Iowa that have created a state-based wireless network where they've actually really leaned in and tried to make sure that their rural areas have access through at least wiring hospitals and libraries and schools. I think that there might be really interesting state level collaborations between a country like India that has a lot of diversity among its states, and actually at the state level in the US, where people have different challenges, states have different challenges, and they're tackling them in very different ways. So it's a huge problem, but I think one that's also really ripe for collaboration. We are getting a clarification that says, my question was aimed more at understanding the direction that AI innovation in India is heading, and that it will continue to serve a subset of society because a large portion that are digitally excluded will not be seen by algorithms. Do we see the gulf between haves and have-nots increasing because of growing use of AI? Oh yeah, that's a great clarification. Sorry for misreading that. And definitely one we have in the US too.
Yeah, well, I think like I would say I would kind of have a very similar answer to that, I'll be honest, and that's mostly because this divide of have and have not, I mean, if it's influenced by technology or like kind of is being affected by technology in that sense. I mean, yes, I guess I can't specifically think of instances in which the technology is bringing this gap. I mean, and that's mostly because I mean, I think like there's a huge population in India that is now becoming digitally savvy, and it's at the same time, I don't have metrics for how much if there's a rural urban divide, let's say in terms of mobile like phone accesses or like other smartphone devices or usages. But I believe that I mean, just technology is just one other aspect of like so many other metrics within the economy. And the unfortunate reality is that the haves that are the first ones to kind of get the latest technology, to work on latest algorithms, or like they have the right access and the resources in comparison to the have-nots, which probably just get it later. But yeah.
Yeah, I do think this idea of representation in the data is really a challenging one, and knowing how representative your data really is, I think is going to be a challenge that we're hearing more and more discussion around globally. I'll be intrigued to see if folks like Nell Watson and others who are working on like the AI ethics committees at IEEE on international standards come up with suggestions or standards and approaches to actually having representation in the data, to make sure that we're aware of bias, or we're aware of kind of an over reliance on certain populations, right, for the trending in the data. But we're a long way away from that, and in all our countries, I think, not just India. Well, Husan, this has been an extremely engaging conversation. I am so glad that I was given the opportunity. Oh, wait, we have one more question coming in, and we have 4 minutes. So I'm going to take this last question. In your research, did you notice if there was a shift in Indian AI researchers favoring other countries, such as the UK and Germany, due to the US immigration challenges?
Okay, so that's interesting. So we did look at the data, but not specifically for European countries. But one where this really came up very evidently was for Canada, and so you can say that, like, I mean, in 2019, about half of all of the invitation to apply, and this is for the Canadian permanent residency, like the green card variant for Canada. So almost half of them, half of the people that were invited to apply were Indians. And one other thing that actually I should say is, and this is where I plug in Zach Arnold's report on Canadian immigration that we had at CSET. So one thing that we also learned was that between 2017 to 2019, the number of US resident applications for the express entry or Canada's the skilled immigration program rose by 75%. And this is like all the non-resident, so basically all non-resident applicants, so US non-citizens, but residents. So you see like this huge move even from the US to Canada that's been happening in the past few years. And yes, like maybe there are those kind of figures that are available for other countries as well, but one that's more evident is to Canada for sure.
It's great. There is this amazing billboard that I think actually included in that report as a picture of, Canada. If you're having trouble with a visa, come to Canada. I think they've really taken the moment, and it's both amusing, but also I think really a shame and a sign of the times that they've been able to lean in quite hard and actually recruit across the border. Well, again, I apologize if there were questions that we didn't get to. Husan, thank you so much for an incredibly engaging conversation. Lynn, I would welcome you back to the stage to take us home. And again, just thank you so much for letting me participate. I always learn something when I'm on a stage with Husan.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you both. Our moderator, Melissa Flagg, our speaker, Husan Chahal, and thanks to everyone who attended and for your many enthusiastic questions and comments. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, as Husan said earlier, please go to our website, cset.georgetown.edu, and sign up for our newsletter and research updates, including a new tracker that we will soon debut to help identify AI companies around the world, in answer to one of the questions that was raised during this session. And you'll also hear about more events such as this one. Our next webinar will take place on July 22nd. It's titled China's Long-Range Investments in AI Growth, Bringing the Public and Private Sectors Together. And it'll feature some of the latest CSET research in this field. In the meantime, please stay safe, and we hope to see you again, if only virtually, real soon.